Do y'all remember this? On January 3rd, 2023, TMZ obtained and released body cam footage from an officer in Indiana who pulled over Bryan Kohberger and his father. The date of this traffic stop was December 15th, 2022. This was while Bryan Kohberger and his father were driving from Washington State back to Pennsylvania for the holidays. Now we need to remember that law enforcement issued a BOLO, a be on the lookout for the white Hyundai Elantra that was issued on December 7th, 2022. So that's 8 days before this traffic stop. And law enforcement was on the lookout for this white Hyundai Elantra even before the public was. During the course of that discussion and that traffic stop, and through information that we learned after this footage was released, we found out that Bryan Kohberger was pulled over not once, but twice in Indiana. Those police stops were just minutes apart from one another. This was one of the first indications to the public that law enforcement just might be playing a game of cat and mouse with Bryan Kohberger, that they might already be onto him as the suspect of the horrific murders of Kelly Gonsalves, Ethan Chapin, Xana Kernodle, and Madison Mogen in the University of Idaho that happened on November 3rd, 2022.
Watching and waiting for the right moment to nab an alleged killer. For several days, reports say an FBI surveillance team followed Bryan Kohberger as he was traveling 2,500 miles across the country to his parents' home in Pennsylvania. And during that time, they knew who their suspect was. They just couldn't move in on him right away. But were they really just watching him, or was there more to it? Were they collecting evidence as he was traveling the country? Were they watching his patterns of behavior to plan their takedown?
So when we're asking the question, could Bryan Kohberger have been arrested if it weren't for the DNA evidence? As many of y'all know, the DNA evidence has been a point of controversy for many people, and it certainly has for his defense attorney, Ann Taylor, and his defense team, as they have been asking for more and more details regarding how the state and the investigators arrived at a place where they found Bryan Kohberger's father is being a matching relative linked to the DNA that was found on the knife sheath at 1122 King Road. As I think Ann Taylor wants it to be, there are a lot of hints in the defense's motions and court filings as we read through them. Since they can't really say anything to the public as a PR statement for their client, I think that they leak information, so to speak, in that regard. We know from one of their filings that they were looking into the certification and training record of one of the FBI CAS team members who was investigating this case.
Says request 109, identity of FBI special agent that is a member of the cellular analysis survey team that was consulted with to determine locations of the cell phone from 1112 and 1113, and all CAS certification records and training records for the involved agents.
So one of the questions this leaves me asking is, when exactly was that CAS team member and other investigators looking into Bryan Kohberger's cell phone and where it was at certain dates and times? Was it before his arrest or after his arrest? Although you might think you know the answer to that question if they were looking into his cell phone records before or after his arrest, based on the probable cause affidavit and everything that we know on an official level, the answer to that question is not clear. If we knew the answer to that question, we would have a better idea of how much they were on to Bryan Kohberger before they got the results of the investigative genetic DNA testing. Were they hot on the trail, or were they cold? So again, what we know from that defense motion that was filed is that the CAS FBI team was looking into Bryan Kohberger's whereabouts using his phone records on November 12th and November 13th. Of course they would. Those are the pertinent dates for a crime that happened on November 13th. They want the identity of FBI special agent that is a member of the Cellular Analysis Survey Team, or CAST, that was consulted with to determine locations of the cell phone from 1112 and 1113, and then all of those certification records. So what we do know based on this statement is that the FBI did use that CAS technology and methodology on the 12th and the 13th to determine the precise location of Bryan Kohberger's phone. So why don't you just go ahead and put a mental bookmark right there, because we're going to come back to that. Now next, in the probable cause affidavit, Officer Payne talks about how they looked for cell phones that were in the area of coverage near the King Road residence between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. on the morning of November 13th. And his known phone number, the phone number that they knew to belong to Bryan Kohberger at that time, did not show up in that area. So there is something very important in that part of the PCA that has often been overlooked, and that is that we can tell by the description there, the method that they used was a tower dump. And what we're looking at right here is a page out of the FBI CAST Field Manual Training Guide from 2018. It says, tower dumps are helpful when specific cell phone numbers have not been identified, however, they can be expensive. Cell phone providers only preserve CDR records for a limited time, yet tower dumps are retained longer. Tower dumps can provide a wealth of information regarding which phones were in a specific place and time. The legal threshold is you need a court order or search warrant to conduct a tower dump. And when you're looking at a specific crime, which is certainly the case here, they're looking at the quadruple homicides of the 4 Idaho students. It says for specific crimes, it determines phones in use in the area. And then the bullets down here talk about how the tower dump is helpful. If you're looking at a specific crime, it says preserves data in case a future suspect develops, and narrows a suspect pool based on knowledge. For example, outgoing call, only 3-minute conversation, not in the area after the crime, etc. From that section of the probable cause affidavit that I just read, we know that this cell phone tower dump method was the first method that was used as they were trying to narrow down the suspect pool, which makes total sense. So the probable cause affidavit then goes on to say, hey, that's no problem. We know that criminals will often leave a phone behind or turn a phone off or put it in airplane mode to try to elude law enforcement. Officer Payne then goes on to say that pursuant to a search warrant from December 23rd, he was able to identify Bryan Kohberger's phone number, traced back to the origin of Albertsville, Pennsylvania, and the account was open in June of 2022. These records also include historical cell location information, also known as CSLI, for that phone number. After receiving this information, I consulted with an FBI special agent that is certified as a member of the CAST team. Members of CAST are certified with the FBI to provide expert testimony in the field of historical CSLI and are required to pass extensive training that includes both written and practical examinations prior to being certified with CAST, as well as the completion of yearly certification requirements. Additionally, the FBI CAST special agent that I consulted with has over 15 years of federal law enforcement experience, which includes 6 years with the FBI. From the information provided by CAST, I was able to determine estimated locations for Kohberger's number from November 12th to November 13th. The time period authorized by the court. And that was, just at that time, the time upon which they were trying to obtain the probable cause warrant. The interesting thing here is that Brett Payne in the probable cause affidavit said that he was able to find X information based on a search warrant that was granted on December 23rd, 2022. However, we as a public do not know the contents of that December 23rd search warrant that was granted to authorities at that time. Now, we do know that it was not until December 27th did law enforcement go through the Kohberger family home garbage and find the samples that contained Bryan Kohberger's father's DNA. They quickly sent them back to their labs across the country, got the results, and that is what prompted the arrest warrant. At least that's my understanding of what prompted the arrest warrant based on everything that we know. So the interesting question and the key question here is that If it were not for the DNA sample and the investigative genetic genealogy hit that led authorities to Bryan Kohberger's father, would they still be able to arrest Bryan Kohberger? Remember, Brett Payne says in the probable cause affidavit that they were able to find out all of these things about Bryan Kohberger's whereabouts and his behavior based on his cell phone from a search warrant that was dated December 23rd, 2022, 4 days before law enforcement went through the Kohberger family home garbage, and then a couple days later found that it was a match, and on December 30th, my birthday, arrested Bryan Kohberger. And I truly believe, my friends, based on what we know right now, because of that broad and strict gag order, that is all we know. And that as far as we can go in extending our logic to determine what evidence exactly prompted Bryan Kohberger's arrest and the order in which all of this evidence was discovered, obtained, processed, and then, put forth towards the arrest of Bryan Kohberger. So what do you think? Could Bryan Kohberger have been arrested if it were not for the DNA evidence? Or another way to ask that question is, if the DNA evidence gets thrown out, is that going to throw out the case? Or will there still be evidence to show that Bryan Kohberger would have been arrested even if it were not for the DNA evidence? Please leave a comment below and let us know what you think, because we all want to know what you think about this complicated question.
I want to bring in two people who know a lot about this kind of surveillance. Tracy Walder is a former FBI and CIA agent, and Mike King is a former detective and the host of the Profiling Evil podcast. His book is called Deceived. Welcome to both of you. Mike, I want to start with you. On the last segment, we left off at finding the family members through the DNA that might have been found at the scene, right? They say there's DNA found at the scene that they think is the murderers as opposed to all the partygoers. And then they go through the databases and they find all the family members. What comes next, Mike? How do you go through the family members to figure out which one is the one you're looking for?
You have to start isolating. And so you hope that there are other forms of evidence that are driving the investigation and that they're collaborating and corroborating with each other. I suspect that law enforcement was looking at this individual for some time, waiting for that DNA to come back. We heard the chief multiple times saying, we're waiting on forensics. But once he hit the road, and that whole thing has just got you scratching your head about the timing of that, of why he didn't fly home, why does dad fly out and meet him and they go together? But the question becomes, did law enforcement follow him from the moment he left Pullman? Or when he was pulled over in Indiana, did people figure out, holy cow, this guy in this white Elantra is heading eastbound? And that's when they put the surveillance together. I suspect it happened on the front end, but we may have been caught a little bit flat-footed. But what's happening behind the scenes is we got to get arrest warrants. We got to verify. We got to hope he stops and grabs a Coke somewhere and throws a straw in the garbage can so we can grab some DNA. And once that comparison's made and validated, then, boy, it's time to move forward.
Or his napkin at the truck stop. Tracy, that's where I want you to jump in, because they're not just trying to figure out who Bryan is and whether Bryan's DNA matches the DNA found at the crime scene. They're also trying to find out cousin Dave, cousin Ethel, well, they don't think it's Ethel, and all the other potential family members that they have to exclude. So are they also sending out strike teams to follow all these other family members to collect their straw and their napkin to eliminate them as the actual match?
So that's a great question. Yes and no. I think, first and foremost, they probably were able to narrow it down to him rather quickly, in that, just to your point, they were able to exclude some of the folks that just weren't people who were capable of committing a crime like this. I am certain that the FBI resident agency that is closest to his hometown in Pennsylvania was probably notified and probably did do some surveillance on his family home prior to Kohberger getting to his family home. I'm almost certain that that took place. Additionally, I think they also watched Kohberger as well and his activities. And I think from surveilling his activities, they were able to really focus in on the fact that he was a suspect, especially when, the lookout came out for the white Hyundai and he happened to have one.
Please remember to hit like and subscribe to support the channel, and definitely leave a comment letting us know what you think.